Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Secretary, I think like a lot of people, I imagine your job as a very incremental one. Build a road, fix a bridge, extend a subway line, but you have tried to organize the department's agenda around some big and broad principles, in particular the role of transportation policy in economic and racial inequality. At the Center for American Progress earlier this year, you said, what decision makers thought of low-income communities is reflected in where and how they built our transportation infrastructure. Certain values of that time are embedded in the infrastructure. What's the problem you see, and what are some of the solutions that you're thinking about?
Well, the basic problem that I see with a lot of our surface transportation infrastructure, and indeed some of our aviation infrastructure, like our airports, is that they were built at a time pre-Voting Rights Act, pre-Civil Rights Act, when the entire community wasn't at the table. And those who were not at the table were on the menu. And the communities that were impacted by the freeways, in some cases were walled in. And economic growth, economic development was walled out of those places. And you can see it in almost every American community. So what I've tried to do is to try to raise visibility about this issue at a time when we're talking a lot about repairing and restoring old infrastructure, because now is precisely the right time to begin tearing down some of those walls and creating more connectivity for all communities so that no zip code is locked out of opportunity.
You know, we were talking backstage a little bit about the classic chapter in Robert Cairo's The Power Broker about Robert Moses, 1 Mile, about the impact of the Cross Bronx Expressway on 1 mile, one neighborhood in the Bronx. Yeah. But you have come to this not only from what you have read about it, but from personal experience growing up in Charlotte. What was your experience with the dynamic that you're talking about?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a community called the Dalebrook community. It was bifurcated by 2 freeways, I-77 and I-85. So I could look out the window and look left, and I could see the fence surrounding one highway, and look right and see the fence surrounding the other one. So it really circumscribed my world and provided a limitation on the horizon and the rest of the community. And those physical and spatial barriers are real. And I think they really present an obstacle to people connecting to each other.
You know, I think a lot of people were surprised last year when Raj Chetty at Harvard did his analysis of which communities in the U.S. have the most and least upward mobility. And one of the things he found that correlated most strongly with the places that had more upward mobility was access to public transportation. In your Beyond Traffic report, you note that only about 1/4 of jobs in low and middle skill industries in major metropolitan areas are accessible by a less than 90-minute transit ride. How can cities create more connectivity, to use your word, particularly for people in low-income communities?
Yeah, well, just a word about Beyond Traffic. Beyond Traffic was the department's 30-year forecast of transportation needs, and one of the interesting facts that we really uncovered in the report was the connection between income inequality and transportation, as you point out. You know, look, I think cities have a responsibility to try to figure out how to do 2 things at once. One, how to help someone who's in a place that is low income or struggling area, to get that person to school, to work, or wherever, and creating those points of access through transit and good road access is important. The other thing that I think cities can do, that the federal government can't do as well, is design infrastructure so that it attracts economic opportunity into those underserved areas. And sometimes a transit line can provide a lifeline, and new neighborhood services like grocery stores, pharmacies, and things that people have not had access to historically.
You know, as someone who lives in Los Angeles, I can say that Beyond Traffic is definitely an aspirational goal.
Yes.
Yes. You know, that was the next thing actually I wanted to ask you about, because I have spent time with mayors this year who talk about the tension, though, between access, density, and diversity. Because they find that when you extend transportation options and you build mass transit options, what you often get is an influx of development that forces out, prices out the people who live there. I know that's an issue in Oakland. I think even in Charlotte, your alma mater, where they are extending their rail lines and worried about what that would mean for low-income communities along the way. How do you balance diversity and density?
A community can't do this work without being really intentional about trying to preserve as much of the community as possible. And there are lots of strategies out there, and different communities have different tools. There's inclusionary zoning. There's land use policies that encourage a mix of incomes in areas.
But you have to want to do it.
You
You're
have
saying
to
it's not
want
going
to
to
do
happen
it.
by
You
itself.
can't just like put the infrastructure in and forget about the land use part. You have to do both of those things at the same time.
So after years of stalemate, the president last December, I believe, finally signed a 5-year, $305 billion highway bill.
Yeah.
Will that meet our infrastructure needs in the years ahead?
Yeah, well, to be clear, he would have signed it 2 or 3
Yeah,
years
yeah.
before Congress finally passed one,
right.
so that was nice. But no, I think it will not suit the whole need for the country. There are estimates that we have $1 trillion infrastructure deficit just related to transportation, and a $305 billion bill will not close that gap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the American Society of Civil Engineers, who puts out the reports, they gave the country's overall infrastructure a D+. Not so great. Roads, aviation, dams, and inland waterways all scoring a D at below. They put the number at $3.6 trillion to bring things up to snuff. Both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are talking about spending more on infrastructure, but no one is talking about anything like that magnitude. What do you think is something that is both significantly addresses the problem, but is it within the realm of politically realistic? What should we be looking at in the next decade for our infrastructure?
You know, I think one of the most difficult things there is to do in Washington, whenever you're talking about a transportation bill, everyone gets their minds wrapped around, well, how are you going to pay for it? And we very seldom ask the question, what are you paying for? And I think what Beyond Traffic starts to help us understand is that we're a vastly different country than we were in 1956 when the first highway package was passed. We're a country that's urbanizing. We're a country that is becoming more dense in terms of population. We have the largest group of Americans now are millennials, and they have different transportation tastes. And if our system does not evolve to meet the demand, if we continue a supply side effort, it's not going to meet the demand.
So talk a little more about that. Do you expect in the years ahead Americans will be less wedded to individual vehicle ownership? And if so, how should federal transportation policy respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing with the millennials, at least so far, when I was 16, I wanted to buy a car. This group of 16-year-olds wants to buy a ride, and that's the basic difference in the way they think about things. Does that mean that car sales goes down? Who knows? But what I do think it means is that the relationship between the car and the individual is going to evolve and change over time. And we need to be ready for that.
And what does that mean for the way we spend dollars on transportation?
Well, what it may mean is that we should put our land uses in, like the places where people live, closer in proximity to where they work, so that people can walk or bike in addition to getting in a car and getting someplace or using public transportation. It also means that we have a responsibility, I think, to think about how we're investing money. Right now, we put 80 cents on the dollar in the Highway Trust Fund into roads. And in an urbanizing setting, you're from Los Angeles, we almost can't put any more lane miles of highway in Los Angeles. And you're now looking at going to the ballot on a new transit measure. But we should be much more flexible in how those surface dollars get used so that we can actually meet the demands of the future.
Part of the challenge there is that the money and the decision-making is almost entirely lodged at the state level rather than the city level. And as you know from your experience in Charlotte, this may become more relevant as we're seeing more conflict between dense, urban, largely progressive or blue places and a Republican dominance of non-urban places politically, and you produce legislatures that are often conflicting with cities on a variety of issues. Is too much of does federal transportation policy rely too much on governors and the states and give too little influence to mayors and cities?
Well, let me just take a stab at being a little controversial today. Look, I think we've got to rethink everything, and the delivery system of the dollars from the federal government to actually getting projects done is part of what needs to be thought about. It's not just a question of where the money comes from, it's whether the money is actually meeting the demands. So we've actually put in our last several budgets additional money for regional and local governments so that they can have more dollars to get more projects done at the regional and local level that address the needs that they have, recognizing that there are sometimes just fewer dollars and fewer support at the state level.
Are
for
urban
those.
needs underrepresented relative to non-urban needs today in the federal government's, the way everyone spends transportation dollars?
I think we're still in a 1956 mindset. We're still in a mindset that the car is king, and that's what people are always going to want. And frankly, there are parts of our country where that's absolutely true. There are parts of our country where you literally cannot have a job without a car. But it doesn't have to be that way in our urban centers, and we should be encouraging people to have lots of different choices. Transportation is the second largest expense for most families. And owning a car is very expensive. So if you have access to public transit or you can walk to work, that's a huge savings to many families.
Speaking of cars, the federal gas tax has not been raised since 1993, even though some states have raised it. In a world where people may be relying less on cars, is the federal gas tax, looking forward, the best way to fund our infrastructure needs?
The federal gas tax has a structural problem, and it's partly that the cars are becoming more fuel efficient. And for a while there, we were actually seeing less VMT. It's going back up because fuel prices have dropped. I think we're going to have some structural changes in how we pay for it, and what that looks like, whether it's a vehicle miles traveled fee or whether there's some carbon tax ideas out there. But to meet the needs of the future, there's going to have to be a departure from the way we've been doing it.
A couple of the reasons that experts expect less car ownership is obviously the rise of car sharing services like Uber and Lyft, but also the rise of autonomous vehicles, right? And earlier this month, these trends converged in Pittsburgh when Uber said it was begin the test of self-driving cars there. How do you envision driverless cars fitting into American cities going forward?
It's going to be one of the most dynamic transformations we've ever seen. What driverless cars are going to enable, first of all, is for many people who are now not able to connect to individual mobility, to have individual mobility. Our disabled citizens, our elderly citizens are going to have ways to get around that are entirely new. I think it is going to facilitate a even stronger push towards a ride-sharing culture. You're going to see dynamics with driverless technology that extend into transit, that extend into trucking, and I think it's really going to transform the American landscape.
18-wheelers with no one behind the wheel?
Platooning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. I mean, after the Tesla, especially after the Tesla accident in May when it was in self-driving mode, there has been a lot of concern raised about whether the driverless features or much less the autonomous vehicles are as safe as the manufacturers are telling us. What is your thinking? What is the current state of the art? Is it safe for autonomous vehicles to be operating in cities at this point?
So 94% of the crashes that happen on the road today are due to human factors, us, we. And we believe that you will see substantial declines in the number of crashes as a result of using autonomous technology. Having said that, there will probably be in the marketplace some type of product that allows the human being to control the car part of the time and allows the vehicle to control itself part of the time. And how that handoff is managed and how well-informed the human being is as to what the car is capable of doing when it's operating the vehicle is very important, and manufacturers are going to have a huge responsibility to make sure the drivers know what the car can do and what it can't do.
You know, earlier this month, the department put out guidance, the first guidance for manufacturers of autonomous vehicles, and the Washington Post headline on your announcement read, "Federal officials plan aggressive approach to driverless cars." The New York Times headline read, "In backing autonomous cars, U.S. tells automakers to figure it out." Leaving aside the vagaries of journalism, since these are 180-degree opposite, which one is a more accurate description of what you are trying to do in this initial guidance, not regulation?
Yeah, well, there are several things. Right now, there's been a bit of a vacuum. It's been unclear how regulators are going to treat these vehicles at all. And so part of the idea of the policy was to fill that vacuum with a clear message about where the federal government intended to play a role. We are making some statements in this policy that I think are very important for everyone. Number one, we're clarifying that we are now using what is increasingly called the international standard for categorizing autonomous vehicles, level 1 through level 5, level 1 being a human-driven car, level 5 being completely autonomous. And so our policy is going to cover levels 3 through 5. We're also clarifying that there's been a big question. When you go to DMV to get your driver's license, the state is effectively regulating your ability as an operator to operate a vehicle. The federal government has federal motor vehicle standards, which are standards that relate purely to the car. And one open question has been, if the software is now operating the car, does the DMV have to license the car, or does the federal government
Well, and
license it?
you said in your statement that the federal government, here's what you said, part of what we're doing with this policy is saying when the software is operating the vehicle, that is an area where we, the federal government, intend to regulate. When a human being is operating the vehicle, the conventional rules of state law would apply. So how would that work? I mean, what does that mean in practice?
In practice, what it means is when the car is driving itself through software, we would use our own standards to evaluate the
So is
safety of
NHTSA
that.
going to set regulations now, software, in terms of sensors, and what's going to happen?
We're going to evaluate the safety of the software, and that the idea is that if car X is using autonomous software, that car shouldn't have to go to 50 different states to get tested 50 different
Just
times.
so I understand, that is not, so if you buy a Tesla now, is that meeting any particular federal standard?
Tesla is at level 2, so it is
Okay.
not covered specifically by levels 3 through 5. But the other part of what I was saying is that when the car shifts responsibility to the human driver, the state still has to decide whether you have to be licensed, and I assume that they would have you be licensed, and they regulate how you manage that
So
car.
the self-drive, the kind of the driver assistance technologies that now exist in many cars, is that regulated at all?
No, most of that is not in level 3 through 5. We're talking about a much deeper level of software.
But after the
technology.
accident, after the Tesla accident, did you look at what about their system contributed to that, or should you be looking about what about their system contributed
We are
to
investigating that situation, and that's one of the reasons why I have to talk at a high level about it, because we have to get down to root cause, and once we have root cause, we can then begin to figure out how to solve that problem.
I've got a lot of other transportation questions to ask you, but I think it would be remiss. You're a former mayor of Charlotte. You are a product of Charlotte. What is your assessment of what is happening today in Charlotte?
Well, it's been a horrible thing to watch. A city where I skinned my knees on the streets, and to see the city at a state of unrest this way, and really having watched several other cities go through similar episodes, it's very tough. Having said that, Charlotte is a very strong community, and it will carry forward. And I think the question will be whether it carries forward better than it's been in the past. I think what people are reacting to is not just an incident of violence between police and a citizen. I think it's also some other issues around education and employment and housing and transportation. And hopefully the community as a whole will aggressively attack those issues.
Has the level of alienation surprised you?
Not really. Growing up there, and frankly growing up in the United States, I see places that are isolated. That's one of the reasons why I brought to the country's attention this issue of how the infrastructure is isolated communities. But we should endeavor as a country never to get to a place where we reach the boiling point. We should listen to people. We should try to do our best as a country to address the concerns people raise, not just to prevent and avert violent issues emerging, but because we have to live together.
Even if we're getting there in an autonomous vehicle, we should all be kind of sitting together in the front seat, huh? Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us this morning. There's a lot to think about.